Hello, and welcome to Doctor Who 50 Years Ago, the show that looks back at the stories that aired in 1972 and 1973 and looks at the differences between then and now. Here we are, looking back at another season, certainly not cashing in on Doctor Who's 60th anniversary by looking back at its 10th, 50 years previous. What we've got here is a Doctor in his prime, a show in celebratory and forward-thinking fashion, being broadcast in a world that's going ever so slightly grungy and trying its very best to be miserable miserably. But television won't allow that on Saturday evening, so there. We're going to go through the differences in Doctor Who then and Doctor Who now, and the socio-political history of 1972 and 1973 as opposed to 2022 and 2023. And because it's an anniversary thing, I've decided to be sociable and invited quite a lot of people to weigh in on the Three Doctors. So, meet the following people.
I'm Luke.
I'm George, aka Headphones UK.
I'm Frida.
I'm Susanna.
I'm Rory.
Nick.
And I'm Ben. Here we are, and here we go into the Three Doctors, a 4-episode story in which a big bad threatens the universe, and all 3 Doctors step in to defeat it. We'll talk about the 3 Doctors in more detail soon, but now, to understand what was going on in the world whilst the 3 Doctors was on air, the news from 1972 and 1973. So I think I'm Richard Baker. Firstly, on the 1st of January 1973, Britain, along with Ireland and Denmark, entered the European Economic Community, the negotiations about which were detailed in full and alarming detail in The Curse of Peladon in the previous season of Doctor Who. After years of being something akin to Schrodinger's European country, Britain enters Europe. Prime Minister Edward Heath sees exciting prospects for improving the standard of living for the British people, whilst Harold Wilson decries that Britain has entered the EEC without the support of the British people and on terms which would be, quote, utterly crippling, unquote. The Times quotes opinion polls saying that 38% were happy, 39% were unhappy, and 23% didn't know anything about all this.
Are 38% of the country allowed to be happy? Something should be done, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. But to quote Doctor Who in 1982, that's democracy for you. But yes, it's fairly interesting that we've come to the 50th anniversary of something which then dominates British politics for the next 50 years and is still going in one way or another.
I know it's crass, but what I find a very interesting detail of back in the day is that what was considered the first standard work in English on the history, structure, composition, powers and procedure of the European Parliament was given to MPs and written by a man named Sir Barnet Cox, who was Clerk of the House of Commons.
How do you spell that last name? C-O-X?
Of course. What else would it be?
Yeah. Well, it could actually be spelled C-O-C-K-S.
That is how it's spelled.
Yeah.
That's why his name is so funny. Costs you £6.75, which would be about £67 in today's money. But worth it to have it on the shelf.
Okay. What was the percentage of people who weren't even aware that Britain had entered the euro?
It was more that 23% didn't have an opinion on Britain joining the EEC.
How much of those people do you think were just young people who didn't really know about it, 50 years later, then voted to leave?
Well,
there's a high percentage chance that was somebody, but ultimately the Times is opinion polling certain people, and presumably getting an average proportion of the population.
yeah, the Times was always the big broadsheet meant for the posh people. So
Yeah. I just wanted to jump in with the point on you're making about young people back then and then voting against it now. I got the impression, it's a bit anecdotal, but so my mum would have been about our age at the time that they had the referendum, albeit this was a couple of years after this, on staying in the EEC. And I think when I've looked at it before, the polling sort of suggests that younger people back then were anti-Europe, and it was older people. So I think maybe that generation never changed their beliefs away from Europe. They were consistently anti it from the start.
That does actually kind of make sense, because when kind of surveys were taken during the whole Brexit thing, it was found that people who were over the age of 70 actually voted to remain because they felt that because they'd lived through World War II, that they felt that they were stronger together than apart.
Yeah. Generally, if people had lived through World War II or had a close experience with it, they've seen what European disunity means up front and personal.
Yeah.
Which perhaps the baby boomer generation has not seen.
Yeah. Well, the baby boomer generation would have been more about the Cold War, so naturally they'd probably be a little bit dismissive towards Europe.
Next, just to make everybody miserable, Vietnam. The fighting's still going on, but in 1972, President Nixon did some foreign policy shenanigans which included talks on ending the conflict. Incidentally, in November of that year, Nixon won his second term in office. The peace talks broke down, and bombing kept going on throughout the whole year, as did North Vietnamese counterattacks on the Americans. 1973 begins with the Americans going back to the negotiating table, having concluded a bombing operation over the holiday season, which history labels as inconclusive. I love me some wars brought about by powerful aggressors.
Yes, thank God we don't have to hear about that anymore.
Right.
And about 30 years later, it would repeat itself all over again.
And over again, and over again. Which brings up my favourite historical mantra of history doesn't repeat itself, people always do. Just in slightly different ways, and that's the kind of things that we bring up on this podcast.
Well, there's a similar quote of a similar kind of thing, which is those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
But then, equally, if we're going to quote the Time Meddler in 1965, I love how we're just throwing quotes about each other. History is written by the people with time machines.
I wonder how... We got Frontier in Space this season, right?
Yeah.
When we get to that, I wonder how Malcolm Hulke's Marxist view of the world is gonna be interpreted in that one, because in that one the big horrible Vietnam War is going to be over, and I wonder if we're either going to see his episode in a different light, or if perhaps there were some changes made to it in the course of it that would reflect this. He seems like the person I would most look to say, "Ooh, that's an interesting thing you did there with politics."
Well, thinking off the top of my head, and this is definitely foreshadowing, he definitely talks about political protests going on about the world in exchange to war tensions in between all the third party trying to stoke up a war in space and a lot of prisons.
Yeah, it marks a contrast to this episode, whose only real political addition it makes is, was it the scientist quotes Yanks, and the other lot. That's about all as political as this episode gets, isn't it?
Oh, let's see what my notes say.
It's definitely not on Inferno levels of having political discourse in it.
Oh, Luke's going to be contrarian, is he?
Yeah.
Oh no, I disagree too.
Of course he
It's
is.
a rather political episode. It's very much a matter of questions of freedom and liberties, and the fact that the Time Lords right at the start break their first law. That isn't politics. What is?
Omega gets introduced to us as the solar engineer who founded Time Lord Society. He's in effect the one who did all the work that brought about the Time Lords. And now we see him, suddenly draining them of all of their power and energy. That, he's the proletariat and they're the bourgeoisie, and he's withdrawing his labour from them.
Well, he's going on strike, essentially, is that?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And what happens as a result of him draining their energy? Power cuts.
Right, absolutely. Yes, this is 1973's 3-day week, but 12 months early.
Yeah.
Eerily foreshadowed by Bob Baker and Dave Martin. I love how we managed to get to this from Vietnam, but there we are. I shall move on to a little thing known as an economic crisis going around the world being our next news item. Lack of supply of grain, growth in the demand of meat from rising incomes, currency devaluations, All these things and more are contributing to what was known even back then as a cost of living crisis. In January, in 1973, the Times of London is reporting how during Heath's government, food prices and rental prices have risen by 20 to 25%. Wide varieties of foodstuffs are having trouble supplying to the right demand, and manufacturers are straining to make food cost even more as the relaxation of government price controls starts to take effect. 1973 is about to become a turbulent time for the world economy.
Not much has changed, has it?
No,
Or
time
about the
always
same
seems to repeat
situation.
What's interesting about this cost of living crisis and the one that we're living through at the moment is that it is somewhat triggered by one of the big powerhouses of the world going a bit rogue. And I think it is interesting, especially in relation to the story that we're talking about. Omega starts to take out his power source, and suddenly the entire universe breaks. I think there is an interesting through line on the fragility of the universe that we've made for ourselves.
The abilities for currency
Yeah.
to travel about is kicked in the teeth by the gold standard being devalued by the US in the early 70s. Again, I'm trying to link it to the power of time travel being threatened.
Yeah, Luke, it's kind of interesting what you're saying there, because we're essentially economic crisis then and economic crisis now. So then you had a budget that was very essentially inflationary at the wrong moment. That was at Barber's giveaway budget, which was around the same time. And then you had the previous Prime Minister of the UK, Liz Truss, give an inflationary budget at the wrong moment. And then you've got the supply side shocks of oil shooting up in price or gas in this case, contributing to the economy going into an inflationary spiral because, as you say, Luke, a world power, a major producer of it, has got upset and has gone rogue, albeit for different reasons. But the similarities are there, aren't they, despite being 50 years apart?
We shall then move on to a little piece of societal history, a tale about a young adult from Nottingham who gets convicted for the possession of cannabis. The Times follows his saga for days on end. He gets 120 hours community service as a sentence, and he ends up working with children with learning disabilities and doing other community work. Over now to our crime and punishment correspondent, Luke.
Oh, Ben, you do not understand just how sad this poor man's story was. He wanted to help mentally disabled children, as the Times almost puts it. It was the 70s, let's move on. What poor Peter Giles wanted, he was the first person in the UK to be given community service because he possessed cannabis. He wanted to use that time to help children with mental disabilities. And he is quoted in the Times as saying, this type of sentence is a forward-looking step. You can... Jumping off the page is the enthusiasm in his eyes. But no, the punishment must be pain. The court system decided that he would have to sweep roads or pick up litter because, and I quote, they say I have got to do menial task. I think they are angry because after the sentence, I said I didn't consider that helping needy people should be considered a punishment. And you know what he did? He was told to clean up a derelict garden for an elderly couple. At least it's not just street sweeping. And I thought that's where his story might end, but I'm afraid that this revelation crushed me. I'm sad to tell you that the Ballad of Peter Giles ends sadly. Only a few months later, the former psychology student Peter Giles, the poor guy was thrown out of his school allegedly. He was fined £5 for shoplifting 83 pence worth of toothpaste, biscuits and cheese, essentials. There was only 83p worth, but they were ordered to pay £8 in total.
What would that cost in today's money, the amount that he stole?
About £8.30.
Yeah, so it's pretty much nothing.
Pretty much nothing. And it's so sad.
Whenever I hear Peter Giles's name, I can't help but think of Peter Miles, aka Nida
Good
in
Lord.
Genesis of the Daleks.
Actually,
Just
I
being
think
caught for possession of weed, having to, do
that actually
community
would be very.
service.
That would actually
Well-
make a lot of sense why he was so dedicated to Davros. He was a junkie, and Davros was feeding him his stash.
Okay, yeah.
And also his greatest crime yet, Operation Golden Age. But there we are. Or was it that thing he did on the radio?
How
Who
much
knows?
community service would Nida have to do for eradicating the Thals?
Maybe that's actually why he was always with Davros. Maybe that was his community service.
There we go. We've cracked Genesis of the Daleks. Who says there's nothing more to say about that serial?
We've worked you out, Space Goebbels.
Good grief. That was our crime and punishment correspondent from LBC, that is to say the Leak Broadcasting Corporation. And lastly, we've scoured the Times' output for the duration of this story, so here's some quick-fire headlines. Girls' coarseness worries headmaster. The headmaster is concerned about how teenage girls are, quote, more difficult now, and the graffiti in the girls' toilets is worse than the boys. Lower drinking age a threat to public order, lawyers say.
Just wait till 24-hour drinking, buddy.
Teenagers under 18 shouldn't be allowed to drink in pubs. Doesn't stop them. Students use calculators in examinations. Said calculators cost £37 in 1973, which translates
£78 now.
which translates into £353 in 2021 money.
Oh, so like I said, economy's not my strong suit. Yeah, that's a lot of money.
£353? That's almost as much as a pint of milk. Hooray!
Because an Apple Mac, which is exactly the same thing, but there we go. Life sentence for murder should be retained. Should other sentences be available? It was ruled out in a court of law. Borough seeks lecturer to teach manners. A councillor in London wanted someone who would teach manners to children for £60 a week, which is £54 more than a miner earned. M-I-N-E-R, I hasten to add. Next thought on TV sex lessons. Because yes, in 1973, Mary Whitehouse of the National Viewers and Listeners Association is worried about the content of sex education for secondary school students.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to prevent teenagers from having sex, wouldn't it be better for the teachers to tell them about sex in detail? I mean, nothing will turn the teenager more away from it than hearing about it from the teachers.
And finally, the AA urges compulsory wearing of seatbelts, which I can connect this road safety theme to Doctor Who by noting John Pertwee and the Splinks adverts about crossing roads safely. And that was the news of January 1973. And now, thoughts on the Three Doctors, folks?
I did have a thought about the Three Doctors, which I can apply to what I did at university, is compared to some of the previous episodes in the Pertwee run, how much more ambitiously this episode is shot in terms of its cinematography. Well, there's a lot of very interesting artistic shots, like at the beginning where the Doctor's looking at the results from the machine and you're actually seeing him through the photo light paper, or when he's first talking to Omega, it's a very long, uninterrupted shot where they're walking around and the camera's moving with them. Or probably the most famous shot of the episode that everyone remembers, when Omega lifts up his helmet and we see that he doesn't have a head, and we see the two Doctors through the gap in his arms. It's all very artistically shot compared to Doctor Who in that time period.
You've also got shots, I think, in when they're exploring the antimatter universe, where the camera's at this really canted angle, and it's really evocative at sort of being able to sort of convey the sense that this is the sort of an unreal environment that they're sort of wandering through. Yeah, it's it's the sort of thing you'd expect to see in a sort of art house film or something. It's that sort of.
Well, the Dutch angle did get to use. It was used a lot in the 70s to sort of convey a sense of otherworldliness.
Yes.
Unfortunately, by the time the late 90s came around, people overused it. Like if you watch movies like The Grinch or Battlefield Earth, they use it a lot in there, and it just looks really annoying.
Mm.
But it's It does feel like a kind of like they knew it was going to be the anniversary, so they went a bit more ambitious with what they could do with the filming and everything. And I think for the most part, they pulled it off pretty well.
Well, this episode was directed by Lenny Main, who also did The Hand of Fear, which the first episode of that has a lot of artsy, weird shots in it. And also The Hand of Fear is also a Bob Baker, Dave Martin story where it's the same story. It was directed
Where
by the same
the villain, down to the villain being Stephen Thorne.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense now, because I think the shot you all talking about shots here. The shot that I can think of, and is quite reminiscent of Hand of Fear. I suppose Hand of Fear is reminiscent of this. Is the opening shot in episode 1. It sort of is focusing on a bit of the nature, and then it zooms out, and it seems there's a bit of artistry going on there. In Hand of Fear, he does a similar shot with I think at the entrance to the nuclear power plant. He directs the camera, and what you're looking is through the mirror. So Lenny Main clearly likes these little trick shots that he does, where there's something a little bit more than just your bog standard Doctor Who director of the time, who just shoots things flatly.
In response to you, Nick, saying it was cheap, I was actually sort of quite struck by how gorgeous the sort of visual design of it was. I mean, this was at a time when colour TV was still like a very new thing. And, this was in like the age of like glam rock and all of this stuff. And you get kind of very lurid use of colour in this. You've got everything from, like Joe's fluffy blue coat and Pertwee's red smoking jacket. You've got whatever the antimatter monster is. You've got, the Time Lord control room with like very vivid blues and oranges. Kind of.
No, I agree. I agree there, Rory. It was very much because when you watch the first series of the Pertwee run, it does feel a little bit muted in terms of the color. But when they got into the second series, it definitely got a lot more bright and vibrant. It was very much like the 1960s Batman series, where because they were in color, they were utilizing what they could show off and to try and display all the bright colors they now had at their advantage.
I'm not disputing your what you're saying, Rory, about it's ambitious. It definitely is ambitious, but I think they definitely didn't put as much money towards it as they could have. There's some word when they're in those cave bits that looks like bubble wrap that they've just put on wooden frames. I think they're saying like it's the entrance to a palace. They have a few flowery words to describe it, and I'm like thinking, oh, these quote like this dialogue is doing a lot of heavy lifting here to make it look a bit more impressive than it is.
And not showing.
I mean, that's just Doctor Who, isn't it?
Yeah, no, but it's just this one just especially seems to me to be a bit cheap, but I think they knew they could get away with it by one being a bit more creative in the shots, and also they've got Patrick Troughton back, so who cares about like if it's a bit wonky.
I'm going to try and predate this and go, does anyone here have dreaded Star Trek lore? Have they attempted to do this from their inception in 1966, 67?
Well, I mean, famously, Star Trek uses antimatter and matter engines, doesn't it? Like it uses the annihilation effect when you combine the two. That's what powers the warp drive. So I think it's it's just this was a relatively newly discovered physics phenomenon, matter and antimatter.
Yeah,
at this time.
It's recently been discovered.
Yeah, about the last 10 to 15 years before this. So they're talking about it as some fringe, well, not fringe theory, but it's a brand new thing. So the public aren't aware so much of it, so they can kind of be more credulous to what can. Essentially, it's not very well told. Like the science here is nonsense, but because it's so new, the public won't be able to poke holes in it.
And I think that's why it's so funny that when we meet Dr. Tyler back on the antimatter or universe, whatever it is, the first thing you hear him / see him doing is writing MC equals E squared.
Equals MC squared, yes.
Right.
I mean, the Time Lords.
Even if you don't know physics, that's something that everyone that's been to school knows is a thing. And it's almost like they're trying to say, see, we do understand science, we're just not trying to teach it to you properly.
I mean, the Time Lords, who are meant to be these like guardians of all of time and space, at the start of this, they don't know what a black hole is.
You've got them powering your time ships, for crying out loud.
You know,
Well,
like because black holes, I guess, at this point in time, were a completely new concept. You know, that had only just become, I guess, the sort of accepted consensus among scientists, and it was like, I guess, it was this sort of interesting novelty for the audience, I suppose. But you know, in hindsight, looking back at it, that's just completely ridiculous.
It's fine. They were just three relatively new members to the High Council who were then accidentally placed in a universe-threatening crisis and didn't know what they had to do to try and solve it. So they broke all their own laws. It's
Their
fine. That could never happen in British politics. It's all good.
Their parents were friends of Rassilon, and he gave them the position because they nobbled him to give him them.
Looking at the episode as a whole, for me, it started off very slowly, and I think even that first scene, I'm not quite sure why some farmer with a shotgun was playing around with that machine and got eaten by it.
It was on his land.
I feel like it took a long time it to become clear what was going on, if anything was going on. It's like, oh, there's a man in a field and there's a machine. Oh, now another man's appeared and the man's gone, and it took a while to get started. I feel like the first 2 episodes more could have happened, and I get it's all about building up tension and suspense. All the cliffhangers were very good.
Well, they always are normally.
Yeah, but the cliffhangers were the only real action in the first 2 episodes.
I get your point there. Structurally, Classic Who is remarkably different in that kind of thing, because ultimately, in the end, we're fulfilling the Terrence Dicks mantra of we can't show the test card, we've got to fill 25 minutes and also tell a story over 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 episodes, which leads to the wonderful adage sometimes where you must, quite literally, play for time, my boy, and have part 2 of the Three Doctors where not a lot progresses until we need it to progress in the story. Yeah, go ahead.
But talking of where the differences in modern Who and classic Who, I think Luke and yourself have already alluded to it. Powerful organism thing. I think that just shows that Doctor Who's not changed that much. You still get terrible technobabble 50 years ago and now.
Yeah.
I would argue that this is the beginning of this season where Jo's becoming more independent, finding her own feet throughout the whole series until we get to the thrilling conclusion to her in the Green Death. Spoilers.
I mean, to be fair,
admit, I've not seen any of the other Doctor and Jo, so I don't know much about Jo. But
what Jo was like, because each of the Third Doctor companions had their different strengths. Liz was a scientist, so she was very clever. Sarah Jane was considered to be a very proactive woman, so her idea was that she was always taking charge of situations. Jo's strength came from how she wasn't the most intelligent, but she did have a lot of common sense, and she had a very good heart.
And lockpicks.
Yes, and lockpicks.
Well, if we're going to look at this from a 50 years ago and now perspective, okay, so the next companion that we have is Sarah Jane, who does have her head screwed on and doesn't suck all the time.
To be fair, some of her first moments in The Time Warrior, she does come off as a little bit, it's like, come on, lady, get the point, you're in the past.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. But, it is somewhat interesting that in her final season, Jo becomes closer to what Sarah Jane will become. The companions are filtered for the audience. So if Jo is supposed to be a filter for the audience, it's interesting that they couldn't make her suck for her entire run. Like, she couldn't just be a wet, stupid blanket the whole time. Nowadays, I think I'm not alone in looking back on Jo and, my inner grandfather comes out and says, pull yourself together, woman.
She was probably the weaker of the Pertwee companions. I still like Jo, but compared to Liz and Sarah Jane Smith, she did feel like the one that almost felt like they hired her for eye candy.
Well,
is there any chance that there was a change in gender equality during this time that they were like, oh damn, we can't just keep making the woman be pretty and
There was,
stupid.
yeah,
We've
yeah.
gotta-
Terrence Dix has been on record if you watch any of the making of documentaries on the Doctor Who DVDs of the serials made around this era, especially with Sarah Jane when he brought her in. He talks about women's lib being a big deal in the 70s, in the early 70s, especially in I think like Robot. I think that's a whole bit where Sarah Jane is actually being a proper journalist, and it's like he mentions about she's going there because of women's lib. They literally bring that up in the episode. So there was this awareness that gender roles were changing, and I mean, the Labour government in the 60s brought in some, or is it the Labour government in the late 70s that bring in more legislation to even out work? I can't remember in the gender disparity, but it's around this era that people are really thinking about gender inequality, or at least starting to correct it a bit anyway.
But even in the Time Warrior, she has a bit where because they make it clear that she's meant to be a feminist, and there's a bit where she's disguising herself as a wench in the kitchens, and she's talking to the other people who work there and said, "Men don't rule the world. We can take charge ourselves." And the women are just looking at her like, "What the hell are you talking about?" So it's sort of showing how much the development of women as people has developed since the Middle Ages.
So there's some generic thoughts on the Three Doctors, but ultimately what we found is multiple themes within the Three Doctors. Ones that you may have heard from us being quite clued up Doctor Who aficionado, so to speak. And the first one of those themes is law, in which we delve quite a lot into the Time Lords, into Omega and his remote stellar manipulator, well, that's later. And what we can do is compare it to later stories talking about Rassilon and the Deadly Assassin and the Five Doctors, and to current Doctor Who lore, which has just spent a few seasons talking about the Doctor's origins.
I came up with this
Yes.
idea around this, which I am terming lore spectacle, where what you're doing is that you're putting stuff down on the canon because, ooh, isn't this cool? So Omega is the person who created Time Lord Society. Oh, isn't that cool, audience? What I think is interesting about putting that in the season opener, as opposed to nowadays where we might put it in the season ender, I'm looking at you, Timeless Children, is that this is, at the moment, it's acting more like this is a nice, fun romp to do. Arc of Infinity was also a lore spectacle episode at the start of a season. Deadly Assassin was mid-season, but it was kind of a messy changeover period as well. And so I think it's interesting that when you've got less stuff to muck around with and to ruin, then what you can do is just make up whatever comes out of your head. Nobody could have told the Bristol boys that, no, you don't understand, like, Omega doesn't exist and this is how he wouldn't be. You can just make it up and it's fun. And he speaks a bit silly and he hasn't got a thing on his head when he takes his mask off. That's all quite cool. And so I find it interesting the creativity that they're able to have at this point versus when Chris Chibnall tried to have some creativity and created what I think we could all agree is the crowning achievement of absolute trash.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I mean,
or I'm going to put it in a neutral perspective and say very controversial.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
Yes, because this is like the first time we see the Time Lords in any detail since the War Games, really. And as I was talking earlier, that they've got this sort of updated kind of glam look. It's very different, I guess, to like our conception of what Time Lords look like now. And it's like, it just makes you think, like, if the Deadly Assassin was never made, would every subsequent Time Lord story be basing their appearance on this? Where they've just got, like, you know, these sparkly blue robes.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about the Deadly Assassin, is that when it came out, people had this criticism of it, which was, well, you just made all of that up.
Yes.
So when they're talking about the seal of Rassilon, the thing of Rassilon, the blah 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 of Rassilon, it's really just some stuff that we don't know what it is. So if they were to keep it grounded in the Three Doctors, kind of method of doing things, then the Deadly Assassin would have had a very different reception, because there would have been more of that, well, at least we know what we're talking about, and it's not just, you made that up.
Let's just say, because, Luke's point on about this being a series starter, I think this was for practicality, though. It's the fact that there's this massive, massive problem, the Doctor solves it, oh, here you go, now you can travel in time again. So it's opening up the rest of the series to not have to be stuck on Earth still.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also kickstarting this whole series in the sense that, because like the sort of 10th anniversary celebrations don't stop with this story. I mean, the whole of season 10 has got like callbacks and things like that. You've got in the Carnival of Monsters, you've got, obviously, that's the Doctor's first free TARDIS trip since his exile, and you've got like the Cyberman appearing on the Miniscope, and then you've got like Frontier in Space and Planet of the Daleks. Those two together. That was meant to be this kind of 12-part space opera Dalek epic in a very deliberate callback to the Daleks' master plan.
Master to boot.
Yes. And with Terry Nation back writing Daleks, doing pretty much the same thing that he did in the 60s with this jungle planet and files and the Dalek base with Dalek measuring equipment. And then it goes back to the Green Death with basically a return to the unit story format, but within this new context.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I think the reason this sort of the way that this lore aspect worked, the reason it worked so well was because it was like, okay, so this is who Omega is, this is what Omega did. Now he's dead, so you can't mess up what it was that he did in the past. It was just, okay, this is a fact. Oh, this is a fact, but... ...
Yeah, absolutely. It's both, lore is both a subjective and an objective thing. It's there to help the story drive along and equally limit and delimit story capabilities in the future. Doctors, Time Lords, other aliens, whatever you have. And equally that then goes into the minds of the viewer and goes, oh, I like that bit, oh, I don't like that bit. And by extension, makes certain fans love things or loathe things. It's all a very tricky thing, lore, quite simply. Moving along, the second theme to discuss is about various characters and various dynamics in this story.
So, I would say, he comes across as very dense, but I've just been thinking about it a little bit. There's a bit of the characters in the serial reflect a class structure, don't they? In terms of, you've got the Brigadier as your upper class, you've got Mr. Ollis, your working class man. This struck me when they meet each other on the antimatter planet, and immediately the Brigadier starts giving him orders, and Mr. Ollis, despite being essentially more knowledgeable about the situation, immediately starts following the Brigadier's orders. Absolutely. Because he's got a posh voice and he's got the pips on his shoulder. And then the Doctor, what's the scientist's name in this? I've forgotten.
Dr. Tyler.
Dr. Tyler. He essentially is the middle class character.
I was going to say, yeah, he represents the middle class.
And he's the most uppity one. Like, he keeps getting ahead of his station. He keeps having rash ideas, sort of reflecting in society that revolutions and that sort of thing come from the middle classes.
I think arguably that's, again, sort of science versus military in a way. The fact is the Brigadier thinks he's in charge because he's this military guy, but Dr. Tyler's like, well, no, I have information and knowledge, so I'm better than you.
I totally agree with you on that, Susanna, because if you look at some of the other Pertwee episodes, you can see the other scientist characters that get introduced doing the exact same thing. So you've got Stallman in the Inferno, who keeps butting heads with the Brigadier because he's so headstrong to drill to the Earth's core. Or you've got Professor Rubish from the Time Warrior, who also isn't very particularly fond of the Brigadier either. So it's this kind of thing of science versus the military, like you said.
For me, the first episode, the Brigadier really feels like just a third wheel that doesn't actually have any power over everyone. The Doctor's very much just like, well, go do that, Brigadier, go do that. And wants to help Dr. Tyler, but Dr. Tyler's like, well, you can't help me. And it's almost like from then on, in episode 2, 3, and 4, it just seems really grumpy.
I think it's also interesting that, like, throughout 1972, the Vietnam War gets so much worse. Like, both the North Vietnamese and the Americans start getting so much more aggressive to each other. And, I mean, I don't want to be too quick to say that, because at the end of the day, like, in 1970, they decided to kind of make the army the good guys when they brought UNIT in, to an extent. But it is interesting. Yeah.
Give or take the Brigadier blowing up the Silurian base and the Doctor hating that.
Well, yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's the only aberration, really. From then, it's all goody-goody two-shoes, and the Doctor slightly getting too ensconced in the echelons of Earth culture.
I mean,
which therefore removing him from the Three Doctors onwards kind of changes his character.
Absolutely.
yeah, in season 7, I think there's a bit more of that kind of ambiguity about the unit, about, and this sort of, I guess, very kind of critical sort of lens that they're shown within. But then I think when Barry Letts fully takes over for like season 8, that's when they become more kind of plummy, sort of, these British soldiers who with a sense of daring do and all of that. And interesting as well, like, it's also interesting that in the first episode they're wearing, well, in the first season, I mean, they're wearing that kind of United Nations looking international kind of uniform. And then when in season 8, when they're brought back, they've just got that sort of green, sort of brilliant British military uniform instead. And so, yeah, that's kind of
Probably leftovers from Dad's army.
yes, exactly. That's what I was thinking. It's got that kind of, more sort of, it's more distinctly British, I suppose.
And it's interesting
In-
that
in-
people.
It's
It's interesting that people still wanted to. I mean, I can kind of imagine Barry Letts in his head is playing toy soldiers, and this was a hugely popular television program. So even though the news is full of horrible, horrible things coming from the other side of the world, it's interesting that toy soldiers and the plucky Brit with the gun is still a trope that people are interested in. It's not like the Vietnam War happens, everyone hates the military, and everyone throws their toys in the bin. Instead, they become obviously there must be some
also,
sort of
it's
separation
interesting
going
how
on
much.
Yeah, I was just saying about the Vietnam War. Like, I think probably what helps here, and perhaps this was a bit of the reason why they moved away from the international to strictly British, as Rory was saying, is the Vietnam War. The United Kingdom was a neutral country in that we didn't get involved in that, so the British Army reputationally didn't get touched by it as such. So, and the United Nations clearly didn't prevent war, so they're a bit discredited. So it's almost like you want to more associate it with the British Army that are not being tarred with the terrible brush of the Vietnam War. So, and it also just plays in with the whole Dad's Army thing going on, and people kind of looking back a bit rose-tinted glasses on World War II. So that's perhaps the thinking there, why it's maybe not intentionally, but it's subconsciously they've drifted the unit to becoming more of a cozy British ideal like that.
In my attempt to sum it up, there are various different ways in which characters in different stories done by different writers and indeed in different producerships are viewed, and depending on the interrelations between one another, how they're viewed and how they're interpreted comes out differently, and therefore the Brig being pushed back to allow the other Doctors through makes sense in the Three Doctors. Moving along to the third theme, the Third Doctors opens season 10 in a big way. 50 years later, we can compare this with many other big openers, both in Pertwee era of Terror of the Autons, Day of the Daleks, but also throughout the rest of Classic Who, things like Arc of Infinity, Trial of a Time Lord, The Mysterious Planet, all up towards the present day in the attempts to really be a showstopper with things like Spyfall.
One of the things that I decided to do was I looked at some other season openers from the early 70s of other TV shows. So I watched the first episode of the second series of Upstairs, Downstairs. And in that we have the introduction of Thomas Watkins, a popular character who ended up in a spin-off. And this, I'm going to read my notes verbatim. It sets up the capitalized gay thing. This guy is sitting one leg over the other, sipping a sherry. Ain't my first rodeo. They're trying to focus more on impending character drama. In Doomwatch, the season 3 and the season 2 opener are both trying to set up like massive amounts of... I don't really want to spoil what happens at the end of Doomwatch season 1, but Doomwatch season 2 starts with everyone going very, very sad. Series 3 also starts with everyone being very, very sad. Dad's Army, I thought might kind of have support my hypothesis a bit, but watching it, I kind of just got the sense that the bloke who wrote it was like, oh, I've got to do another one. I guess I'll do another one. They'll put that one
Pretty
first.
much, yeah.
Pulling it
Well,
out.
the Dad's Army was made by two different people who famously disagreed a lot behind the scenes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so
Different script, yeah.
that's kind of why I think that some of the dialogue in this episode and is so kind of clunky, and also why it's good to have the second Doctor and the first Doctor in it. Spyfall is this big globe-trotting spectacle, but you can't do that now in 1972 because you can't afford it and it would look like trash. But what you can do is you can get the old bloke in who can walk around to saying funny things, and everyone can just mention how important everything is, and it's cheap to do that. It is very cheap to say things look expensive.
Pretty much every season opener of New Who introduces either a new companion or a new version of the Doctor. There are very few that are just, oh, another series of the same group.
That's true. That is very true, yeah.
And even if you look at like Impossible Astronaut, for example, okay, so it's Doctor and Amy and Rory, we've seen them already, but it's introducing a whole new story arc with everything to do with River Song's background. The Asylum of the Daleks, well, it's the beginning of the end of Rory and Amy. How did I forget Amy's name there? No, I think it's kind of hard to compare when essentially New Who, every series really is the start of a new era.
Actually, I was just thinking about this. I was thinking, oh, you know what? Back in the 70s, as we set up the seasons around it, like Day of the Daleks or the two Autons season openers, they're a lot more spectacle-ridden at the start, and then the final episodes, they're not so much built up to a finale or anything. Well, New Who, it's like the finale is the be-all, end-all. But actually, I think the reason, I think you touched on it there, Susanna, is that because most of the season openers introduce a new companion, that they're quite low-key, but then the ones that don't actually do switch back to this big spectacle. As you say, the Impossible Astronaut, that's quite a spectacle-ridden one. The Sign of the Daleks, that's trying to be spectacle. Series 9's opener, The Magician's Apprentice, going back to Skaro, that double-parter, that's some spectacle there with the Daleks.
That brings law back as well. That's changing.
Yeah, so the
starts
seasons
of Davros.
Yeah, well, so that's, and then the Spyfall. So the seasons that aren't introducing essentially a whole new cast, they do actually have the spectacle now, which I had until you said that I hadn't thought about it like that. But yeah, I guess
it is a fair point actually, because actually now thinking about it, the episode New Earth, which was actually the first episode of Doctor Who I ever saw, it does actually have kind of a laid-back feel about the whole thing.
Well, if you're trying to introduce
that, and obviously this New Earth specifically not only introduces the 10th Doctor fully, but it is also, we get more of the face of I believe is when we see him there, and that's a whole extra arc that then develops. And I think that's just the way that TV is written now. It's just different. It's almost like back in the 70s, they were like, well, we need to start big to get people interested in the show. Now, you know, they've got a 60-year-old fan base. They start easier.
One final point, please, before we move on. Go ahead.
Brain, what was I saying? Yeah. So when you're introducing the new companions nowadays, if we look at something like Partners in Crime or Smith and Jones, they have fairly simple stories. They're not these really complex layered plots. And I think that's kind of...
A Doctor Who, that is.
Well, yeah. But...
It's because obviously in any other show, transporting a hospital to the moon is not a simple story.
That's true. It would be weird
in
EastEnders.
Is it a moon or is it an egg?
However, if we look at the first 2 episodes of this one, as we said earlier, they are kind of meandering, and John Pertwee is just looking at pieces of gravel and going, ooh, which allows the lore stuff to become more impactful later. But also, we are introducing Patrick Troughton again. Part of the spectacle of this story is, oh look, we got Patrick Troughton back, and he's playing the recorder, and he's acting a bit goofy. You don't want a load of exposition dumps to get in the way of the fact that Patrick Troughton is very funny, and he does that silly little jig thing. We kind of need to, it's just for a second, sit back in our chairs and allow Patrick Troughton to be funny.
What I see here is a very fine balance between the banal and the incredible, the explosive openings and the same old with a bit of new twist. And we can compare and contrast that with different stories and different shows 50 years ago and now. But finally, onto that last theme, the Three Doctors is indeed the first of the fabled multi-Doctor stories. And there's been many since, thanks to the Three Doctors, that we can compare to.
So yeah, now I thought to compare it to Day of the Doctor, because it also has 3 different Doctors in it. And it was interesting because with this is the first multi-Doctor episode, and they do put primary focus on Pertwee. They still make him the main character, whereas Troughton is more of a supporting character, and Hartnell is just sort of there. I love how we haven't even really mentioned Hartnell because he's barely in it.
I just don't understand why he's in such constant conflict with himself. Like, he has more empathy with his arch nemesis than he has for himself. He's got some proper issues.
That's just his character. He's just a grumpy old man.
Well, no, but that's interesting from the writing perspective, in that what they're doing here is trying to draw out as much banter as possible, because that's what they're considering to be fun and cool. It's like the Avengers nowadays. They fight each other, and that's kind of cool. We like seeing them fight. So you're right, Frida, when you say, like, yeah, they are arguing all the time. It is interesting, like, are there points in the show where the Doctor gets along with himself?
Well, yeah, no, there's basically none. I mean, if you compare this to, like, an episode like The Rebel Flesh, where he has a copy of himself, then he constantly gets along with himself.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point, Frida, yeah.
Is the Rebel Flesh more plot-heavy? Because if it's something more plot-heavy, then they're going to have to work together more to actually progress the story. Whereas if you're bantering and joking, that slows the story down for some fun.
I think a good scene to compare this to, really, it is in Day of the Doctor, when they are all put in like the prison cell room, and they're trying to work out how to get out of it. And of course, it turns out the door isn't even locked. But you see the 10th Doctor, the 11th Doctor, the War Doctor, all having such conflicting ideas, not quite realizing, oh, why don't we just put our minds together? Which in the end is how, 2 and 3 end up solving the problem as well, is they eventually stop bantering and they're like, hang on, we're both the Doctor, we're both super smart, we can do this.
Yeah.
And it's definitely an interesting contrast, because 10 and 11 are actually quite similar in character. They're both quirky, they're both reasonably young.
I think if you're going to compare a modern multi-doctor story to this one, the Three Doctors, I think what would be telling is, so here in the Three Doctors, they only think, you know what, let's just bring back Troughton and Hartnell as a little advisory role, but let's bring back Troughton. And they have no interest in bothering with any other callbacks of the Second Doctor era at all, really. They don't bother to try and bring back Jamie.
What? No, they
Crystal
tried,
to it.
but
Oh, did
he
they?
wasn't around, so that's why Benton is good in this episode, because he just
Oh, I
pinched
see.
Jamie's lines.
Right.
Yeah,
okay,
Fraser Hines was busy in Emmerdale, I think.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
it.
That's a shame. But okay, but still, they didn't try. They didn't bring back Cybermen for this episode, or that was quite a recurring villain for them. Something like that. They didn't really think, oh, let's do all the nostalgia for it. They were just like, right, let's have Pat Troughton come back. But then,
Yeah, I think the thing.
in Power of the Doctor though, they it's like, in order, not just having like the flashbacks with all the classic Doctors, it's also like, well, we've got to bring back all the companions as well. I mean, albeit it's just a couple, but it's like there's a little bit more. Yeah, let's pull on the nostalgia heartstrings. Well, here it's all just like, it's just a novelty, like a novelty that you got Troughton back. It's not like they're not going full on the nostalgia.
That's
Which is,
true.
I think
There's-
I think the thing with the Three Doctors is that I think Pertwee only agreed to appear with Troughton and Hartnell on the condition that he would be made to be front and center. I think he was very possessive about his own role as the sort of the leading man, really. And I think, yeah, that because I think he was, even like, you know, in Day of the Daleks, when they brought the Daleks back, he was initially reluctant to even appear alongside the Daleks because he was, I guess, that insecure, I suppose. And I guess that kind of is why this, you know, the Three Doctors ends up coming across just like a Pertwee episode with like cameos of Troughton and Hartnell.
but they
Leading
still
actor
could have.
syndrome is a
That would
Luke?
explain the argument he had with Troughton when he was with Terry Wogan during Children in Need.
leading
they-
actor
they-
syndrome
they-
is a very tricky point. Sorry, Luke, I must have a bit in here somewhere.
Yeah.
Leading actor syndrome is a very tricky point. We've said those bits with because ultimately, as you say, you're the lead actor. The entire television show is on your point, and then suddenly you bring in a thing like a multi-doctor story where suddenly you have to share it between 2, maybe even 4, or in some cases, as we're getting into Dimensions in Time, 5+ other doctors, to the point where Tom Baker goes, "No, I'm the Doctor. I'm not turning up for the 5 doctors. Use me in Shada." Ultimately, the multi-doctor scenario is a wonderfully popular concept. 12 million viewers at the end of episode 4 for this story, and equally very high viewing figures compared to things like Power of the Doctor. That got high viewing figures. Enormous figures for the 50th anniversary in the Day of the Doctor and the 5 Doctors. So it's used towards an end and makes people happy, and yeah, marvellous things, really.
Well, hold on. It's interesting that, as you said, that leading actor syndrome was able to perhaps exert some control over this when it's such a low-key production with not as many people in it, and it's more like a stage show with monsters. Then if you're the lead actor, you're going to have a lot more power. If we compare this to how TV is made nowadays, it's a small army just to film David Tennant walking up some steps. So David Tennant is going to have, presumably, a lot less power. If we look at how Day of the Doctor was being made, Chris Eccleston said, "I will come back on the condition that Joe Ahern directs it." Now, back in the day, it's possible that maybe John Pertwee would have had some say over a director he liked or didn't like. I'm not entirely sure on that. But Stephen Moffat basically said, "Well, no, goodbye." So
Yeah,
the actors these days aren't going to have, even a leading actor is not going to have as much power, because presumably because the productions are so much bigger and there's so much more money floating around.
yeah. And the people who are actually running the production have a lot more power than the actors do.
It's
And
definitely an
I just
ultimate
wanna
check
sort
and
of-
balance.
Yeah, I just sort of want to conclude on sort of the nostalgia aspect that Nick brought up, because I think that is why I enjoyed, Power of the Doctor so much, because it was just filled with filled with stuff. But then again, it wasn't just to celebrate Doctor Who; it was to celebrate 100 years worth of the BBC.
yeah.
And you know, I got very excited when I looked. They actually did a list of 100 things, the 100 years, and Doctor Who is the only thing that appears twice on the BBC's top 100 important things that happened.
What's the other one?
As in Doctor Who, both versions of Doctor Who are mentioned in the
classic and modern. And that quite frankly, is a very testament to the whole of Doctor Who, that it can be so important in the BBC that it's 2% of the BBC in total, both Doctor Who 50 years ago and now. So that was our attempt to look at the Three Doctors and its place in Doctor Who history as a multi-Doctor story, full of lore, as a season opener, with various characters and themes, in a socio-political context of 1972-73, whereby political, historical
vegetable
is going
and
along
mineral.
the world. Vegetable and mineral, thank you, Luke. It's going mad across the world, but it doesn't matter, folks, because a television show, a children's sci-fi television show, which is also good for adults as well, has managed to reach its 10th anniversary year. So that, yes, they're going to put on their nostalgia goggles because it rakes in the viewers and helps them. Add in a little bit of lore, which seals its place in history, so much so that it's put in the history of the BBC twice, and indelibly leaves its mark on British culture and indeed the rest of the world's culture, whether we like it or not, because of his influence both 50 years ago and now. Thank you very much for listening. You can find us on Blogspot, which redirects to the audio version of this episode on iTunes, hopefully. Leave positive comments there, it helps. If you've watched the slideshow version on YouTube, you can like, comment and subscribe. We're available on Facebook also. We shall be back next time to look at Carnival and Monsters in one format or another. Until then, I have been Ben.
I've been Susanna.
I've been Frida.
I've been Nick.
I've been George.
I've been Rory.
I've been Luke.
And I have been Ben. Thank you and goodbye.